Today marks 400 years since the death of James I of England and VI of Scotland. Despite being such an important and controversial king, in the popular imagination he is usually known via other people, either his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, his cousin, Elizabeth I, Guy Fawkes, who tried to murder him in the Gunpowder Plot, or his son, Charles I, and the British Civil Wars. Insofar as James is front and centre of any films or TV shows, like the recent Mary and George, he's usually portrayed as a decadent monarch, uninterested in the affairs of state. Yet my guest today, eminent historian Clare Jackson, challenges all these misconceptions. Her upcoming biography argues that James is an important, accomplished, and fascinating figure. On the show today, we touch on the importance of his rule in Scotland before he ascended the English throne, the skill with which he managed a peaceful transition from the Tudors to the Stuarts, and the seeming contradictions in his worldview, why his belief in the divine right of kings was compatible with his belief in diplomacy and religious toleration, and why someone so devoutly Christian also had homosexual relationships. Claire and I also discuss the recent popularity of the Stuarts in films and on TV, and why their conflicts with Parliament about the proper role of monarchy are relevant to Donald Trump. I hope you enjoy the show. Clare Jackson, thank you very much for being a guest.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start by asking, what is your favourite word?
I've always liked the word sequoia.
Nice.
I like sequoias too, but I like the word.
It's almost got like an onomatopoeic sort of quality. What is your least favourite word?
Issue. I don't mind it as a verb. I mean, if you issue a directive, that's fine, but I can't stand it being used as a substitute for anything. You know, if you've got any issues with this, it's the only time I've ever found myself yelling at the radio when they were talking about a lot of issues on the M11. Okay, they're not issues. They're cars.
What is your favourite swear word?
I did like the comment recently when they were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the shipping forecast that actually any of those three, any three bits of the shipping forecast said together quickly enough would make a brilliant swear word. Like 40s Cromitty Dogger.
Well, I was also going to ask if anything about James prompted you to use your favourite swear word.
No, he had a pretty colourful vocabulary himself. He also had a very wry, I think what they often call in Scotland, a kind of pocky sense of humour. And that sometimes landed well and diffused a situation. Other times it probably only inflated it.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
Probably like many people, the sound of the sea. Being in Cambridge, it's a bit landlocked, and whenever I hear a seagull around here, I kind of assume they're lost.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
I don't know, other people's conversations on sort of FaceTime where I don't think they realise how loud it actually is. I really don't think if that person was sitting next to them, they'd be having the conversation at that level of volume.
Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Got lots of pleasures, but I don't think they're guilty. I decided I could either feel guilty eating chocolate or not feel guilty, and they're just pleasures.
What is your favourite book?
I don't think I've got a favourite book. I tend to sort of be quite itinerant, sort of hop from author to author, so I sort of go on binges of particular authors. So I was recently reading lots of Adam Gopnik, who I think is a terrific writer. Actually, the book that I would like to admire is it Susan Hill? Howard's End is on the Landing, where she places a moratorium on book purchases for a year and decides to reread books. And I'd love to have the discipline and the time to do that, because I think most books totally repay rereading at different stages in one's life.
I mean, the one of the good things about starting this podcast is that it's made me disciplined in my reading, because I sort of have to read for the guests, whereas usually I will start a book and then wander into Waterstones and buy 5 more. And so it's made me much more disciplined in my actual process.
Yeah, I have a three. It's only got three shelves on it, but a bookcase with three shelves called the Aspirationals at home, and it is just overflowing. And that should be the sign that you are buying more books than you are reading. But one of these days.
Finally, is there a fictional character who you imagine yourself to be?
No, I often sort of admire fictional characters, more often in children's books. I think, sort of people like the Moomins are very admirable. I remember actually as a child seeing a picture of in a children's, in a sort of illustrated book, a picture of a dormouse, and they were trying to explain hibernation, and this dormouse was in bed under a duvet with a little candle and the biggest stack of books ever. And I remember just thinking, wow, if that could be hibernation, I'd sign up for it immediately.
So I'm a history buff, and I thought by asking what drew you to it, and also what drew you to the Stuarts in particular.
What drew me to history?
Yeah, and then the Stuarts.
I don't know the answer to the first question. It was just always there, which is a very sort of dull answer, but it's completely true. So there was never any question in my mind but that I wanted to study history. So when it came to choosing A-levels or what to do at university, it was just there. I mean, there are bits of the history that I studied at primary school that stuck with me, like generations of children of a particular era. There were sort of very colourful R.J. Unstead sort of illustrated histories. I remember doing a project on the bridges across London, and then one Sunday we just went up and looked at them all, and thinking about the different times that London had been crossed, really from the Romans onwards. So I don't know. I just always was interested in history, and it was always my favourite subject in that sort of way. What drew me to the Stuarts? I don't know. This is probably the equivalent of witchcraft, isn't it? Doing history chronologically backwards, but just because of the type of history I studied at different phases. When I was doing GCSEs, that was very 20th century. I did A-levels, that was very 19th century. As an undergraduate, I did a lot of 18th century. And then finally in my final year, I did a course which was really influential on the sort of historian I became, called The British Problem, which was looking at the makeup of early modern Britain from about 1500 to about 1750, and as a multiple monarchy and the interrelationships of England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. And that involved things like the Reformation and the Civil Wars. And to me, it is such a dramatic, tumultuous period that I've never felt the need to go any further back. I just got stuck and hooked.
There seems to be a sort of renaissance in interest about the Stuarts recently.
It's a bit overdue.
Yeah, well, I was going to say a lot of TV shows are very Tudor focused or Victorian time focused. But now there are shows like Mary and George. There are films like The Favourite. So I wondered if you might have any ideas about why this sort of renaissance.
Well, I think it's some of it is redressing the balance. I mean, you're right that for a long while, the Tudors, had a kind of monopoly over sort of screen representations. So when I made 5 films now about 10 years ago in 2014, 2015 for BBC Two on the Stuarts and the Stuarts in Exile, and that really spanned from 1603 through to about the 1750s, sort of looking at the sort of final Jacobite challenges, and an amazingly, phenomenally talented production team that I was working with at BBC Scotland and BBC Two. One of the challenges was that it's a very complex century, the 17th century, and just because something's complex doesn't mean you should shy away from it, but you do need to think about how to construct a narrative that can comprehend complexity. So I think I think that's part of it. I think maybe there's now an understanding or a prominence attached to religious extremism and radicalism that begins to make sense when we talk about sort of Europe's wars of religion in the late 16th and early 17th century, that that has a particular kind of traction. And I think the sort of history that I'm interested in, the makeup of Britain as a multinational state, again has resonances. The UK's constitutional future is uncertain, to put it that way. I think there are various both contemporary. I think historians are way too reluctant sometimes to admit that the periods that they study are informed by present debates. I mean, I think clearly they often are. And also, global history has really taken off in the last generation, and this was an era in which colonial settlements, imperial exploration is really taking off as well. So I think that has an added attraction.
I mean, something interesting ahead of this interview was I follow various American legal people on Blue Sky, and there's increasing talk about Trump's Stuart view of the Constitution.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so I thought that was very interesting.
I remember someone here asked me around about the time in the first presidency, at the time that some of the kind of insider memoirs were coming out, and a friend was saying they were trying to write an op-ed, and I said, "Oh, have you ever thought about Anthony Weldon and James the Sixth and First?" Because this was a very inflammatory, posthumously published account of James's court that came out in the 1650s, but that then proved so disproportionately influential in terms of how James was very negatively depicted for generations. And actually, the colleague went away, wrote the piece, and came back and said, "Oh, I was really shocked by the comparison." So that's kind of interesting.
I think it's the his sort of attempt to control funding at the moment that's already been appropriated by Congress. So these various American jurists are talking about a Stuart approach to the Constitution.
That's interesting. And also, the Stuart period has always had a particular attraction for American legal historians. They often sort of tend to locate James's reign, and particularly the works of Edward Coke as being very foundational. There's lots of counter-arguments to say it's not that simple. Bonham's case in 1610 does not really create modern judicial review, but nevertheless, that's always the kind of locus classicus that a lot of American legal historians go back to. And it also coincides with the founding of Virginia, creation of Jamestown and other sort of key moments, and the sailing of the Mayflower.
I've always found that the way the history is usually taught, especially in Britain, is that it's sort of separate blocks, and sort of one block seamlessly follows the other. So there's the Tudor block, and then there's the Stuart block, and then the Hanoverian block. And then when it comes to the Stuarts, it's as if James just sort of appeared out of nowhere in 1603 and just rules as a blank slate. But what I found so interesting about Devilland, and I imagine you go more in depth in the biography, is that James came to the throne after decades of ruling Scotland, interacting with Elizabeth and her government, cultivating diplomatic relationships with other courts of Europe. So I wondered if you could give an overview of James's life and reign before 1603.
That was very much part of the sort of the animating spirit, I hope, of the book that's coming out in the summer, called The Mirror of Great Britain, which is a life of James the Sixth and First, and it really is very much the Sixth and First, because, as you say, there is a tendency. It's both sides of the border, I find. Scottish historians know a lot about James the Sixth, who is born in 1566 and is crowned in 1567, aged 13 months. Who rules Scotland then for nearly 4 decades, until carries on ruling Scotland beyond that, but is sole ruler of Scotland until 1603. And then, naturally, there tends to be a bit of a waning of interest once the royal court shifts to England in 1603. And then, conversely, English historians, as you say, tend to assume he sort of drops from the sky, and you often see references to him being a sort of new, inexperienced king. And this is somebody who himself says to his English common law judges the day after his 50th birthday, he says, by the time I came to the English throne, I was past middle age. I was an old king. That's very much how he sees it. So one of the things I want to do hope I do in the book this summer is try and flatten 1603. It is a massively important event, both in James's own life and in the future of the sort of Stuart dynasty, that they become rulers of England and Wales and Ireland, and they still have this euphemistic addition of France. But it isn't a fundamental eruption. And I think often, even in biographies, you tend to get lives, very learned lives of James as King of Scotland, exclusively up to 1603, or his English reign, and inevitably trying to do both is ambitious, and it's involved sort of concisions and all sorts of things. But I wanted to make sense of this as kind of one person bringing, as you say, a wealth of experience So for listeners who aren't familiar with the chronology, James is the only child of Mary Queen of Scots and her second husband, Lord Darnley. So Mary Queen of Scots had been raised at the French court, had married the heir to the French throne. He had acceded as Francois II, but had died quite soon after. So Mary returned to Scotland in 1560, the early 1560s, in a country that is undergoing a radical Protestant Reformation. She marries an English cousin that solidifies or certainly strengthens her claim to the English throne. It's a marriage that isn't particularly harmonious, quickly gets very sour, but one product of that marriage is James. He is born in June 1566. His father is murdered when James is a baby in the following February. Mary's complicity in his murder is widely suspected, and it's not helped when she then marries the principal suspect in the murder, the Earl of Bothwell. And that is a very sort of chaotic, extreme period in Scottish history in which eventually a group of Protestant nobles called the Lords of the Congregation decide they've had enough, and they basically force Mary to sign letters of abdication in favour of her son, who is at this point 13 months old, James. And he is basically raised by a group of committed Protestant nobles who want to sort of shape James into a godly king. He has a phenomenal education overseen by George Buchanan, who is one of Europe's leading humanists. He becomes probably, almost certainly Britain's most scholarly king, but he may well have been, in a way, the most scholarly early modern king anywhere. And so much of that is a product of his education. His mother, meanwhile, is imprisoned, escapes from her prison, tries to raise an army that is defeated, and then a 5-year civil war ensues. So James's early years are ones in which there's a great premium placed on protecting him from abduction or assassination, or being abducted, particularly by his mother's supporters, who are enemies of his regime. His mother flees to England, which is a pretty disastrous decision on her part, and then spends effectively 20 years under sort of house arrest and imprisoned before Elizabeth I orders her execution in 1587. There is that long period in which James is King of Scotland. Obviously, he's a very young child at the beginning of it. He begins to assert more personal control from about the age of 11, 12 onwards, but there are regents. There are 4 regents who have nominal head of government while he's a child. All of them meet violent ends. So it is a very turbulent period in Scottish history. 1580s and 1590s, James is a young king, but he begins to certainly assert more centralised control. And by the time he comes to the English throne, he has decades of experience.
There are aspects of his worldview that they seem antithetical to me. I guess because of now, like, on the one hand, you have the sort of divine right of kings, which to me seems like an extreme position. And then there's a sort of middle course on religion and toleration. And then there's a sort of preference for diplomacy, which divine right of kings immediately makes me think of sort of glory hunting monarchs. So I was sort of curious about what is that worldview that he had?
I think you start with the divine right of kings. I think it would be a pretty extreme view to find anyone in the early 17th century who didn't hold that view, if you know what I mean. Not believing that God had specially chosen this person to rule, and that this is why there is so much fuss if you think about the blood of monarchs, why there is something blue. We often refer to it as sort of blue blood, but why an illegitimate bastard child, somebody is not physically the same, is how the early modern mind would think about it. That there is something qualitatively different about a divinely ordained monarch and their body and their blood. So believing that God chose James and his legitimate heirs is not an unusual position to hold. It seems it was pretty widely held, even in the very early years of Elizabeth II's reign. I mean, a lot of the ritual that associated with the coronation and the anointing with oil, and we saw all that in Charles III's coronation a couple of years if you then begin to tease away at some of the implications of that, I mean, probably the interesting thing about James is, because he was a very often seen as one of Europe's sort of preeminent exponents of that theory, he also takes very seriously the implications. So that relates to things like, for example, witchcraft. I mean, if God has placed you on earth with a particular onus to rule in a godly way, you have a responsibility to root out the representatives of Satan. You also have a much bigger reckoning at the day of judgment with your God about how you have ruled than somebody who doesn't have as much power as a king. So James takes very seriously the divine right of kings, and he writes and publishes two works, particularly Basilica and Doron and the True Law of Free Monarchies, which both he publishes as King of Scots in the 1590s. And one of them he says, this isn't, I'm paraphrasing, but this isn't a manifesto for tyranny. In when I say that I am all powerful, it is actually to show you. And he describes God as the sorest, sharpest schoolmaster that could ever be devised for anyone. And there's kind of memories of Buchanan being a very sore, sharp schoolmaster. So I don't think that is odd. How that then syncs with, as you were talking about, a more tolerant, we might say sort of politique, sort of pragmatic approach to religion, I think also meshes with this. I think he is very suspicious of religion being used to cloak political pretensions. So both in his well-publicised disputes with the papacy, and that's more while he's King of England, post-Gunpowder Plot sort of era, but he is very, very hostile to the papacy's claims for temporal supremacy and the Pope's right to intervene in other countries' affairs. But equally, he is very suspicious and resistant to claims for political involvement of Presbyterians and people who want to use, as he sees it, religion as a cloak for political ambition there. I think James instinctively is interested in the complexities of theology. He doesn't think these are arguments that necessarily admit of simple solutions. So even when he becomes centrally involved in very complex, mostly continental theological controversies in his reign, particularly to do with theories of salvation, readily he will admit, I would not be somebody who would pretend certainty on this. However, my view is X. But I mean, he thrives on debate and discussion, and both in sort of evidence arising from his library, from the people he invites from the continent to be around him. There's a sort of well-worn practice of being read. He's often read aloud to at dinner tables, and I mean they're often very, very topical, also very complex tomes of philosophy and theology. So he relishes debate. I mean, the first thing he does as King of England is summon the Hampton Court. Well, one of the first things he does is convene the Hampton Court Conference to try and debate some of the areas that are still under discussion in the Church of England. So I think he can be both very politique, as I say, and pragmatic and open-minded. I think he's also very sensitive to the potential for persecution to make people hypocritical in their religious beliefs. At the same time, there are red lines around his right as monarch to decree certain to decree the law. So the oath of allegiance that he levies on all Catholics after the Gunpowder Plot in England makes no attempt to challenge the Pope's claims for spiritual supremacy, but it makes very clear that Catholics should renounce the Pope's right to depose heretical rulers and swear total political allegiance to him. So he is very clear in his own mind about the demarcation between politics and religion, in that sense, in a world in which they often overlap. I mean, if a good Catholic is told by the Pope that they should remove a heretical ruler, obviously the boundary lines are very different for them in that context.
I suppose the this idea of sort of Judgment Day and reckoning, would that sort of line up with his preference for peace and diplomacy?
Yeah, I was just thinking your third part I didn't really answer after you talked about the divine right of kings, then you talked about sort of politique, sort of moderation. I think it is also all accompanied by, in James's case, a preference for peace generally, that warfare, that fighting, killing one another, especially between Christians. I think this is something that really worries James, that this is a century. I mean, James doesn't live for all of it, but this is an era in which religious warfare can be at its most brutal. And for James, when there are threats, say, from the Ottoman Turks, it is not a good look for Catholics and Protestants to be killing each other in their thousands. At the same time, James is also a pragmatist, and both in Scotland and in England, this is not a wealthy monarchy. So he is also very clear in his own mind that he doesn't have the resources to deploy great armies. And although he can be slightly, and is mocked sometimes by foreign diplomats and ambassadors for being a king of words and not of bullets, and there's jokes about him forever sending ambassadors instead of armies. A negotiated settlement is something he can try and achieve, and does achieve in certain contexts. That is better than a humiliating defeat involving death and destruction.
I mean, there's a particular line I liked from a letter from Sir Robert Cecil to James, essentially saying, princes are poor, they need money, and if they don't have money, make a treaty.
Yeah, and James buys that completely. I mean, he tasks Cecil with trying to resolve a problem that isn't resolved in his reign of crown finance. It is all very well, as he thinks, for English MPs to get very worked up about the need to deploy armies and to secure a great Protestant victory and all the rest of it, but where is the money? Cecil works very hard and comes up with what is seen as a radical proposal called the Great Contract in 1610, whereby James will surrender certain of his prerogative powers in return for a substantial chunk of money or sort of each year. And this is resisted by MPs. There is still a very old-fashioned, out-of-date view among the English political establishment that had also been there in Scotland, that monarchs should live off their own. And James tries to point out that Elizabeth had been famously parsimonious. He is trying to sort of restore some gloire to the English court. He also has a queen and children. This is a royal family. This is going to be more expensive. Ruling three kingdoms is both expensive and also has implications for the sort of strategic diplomatic questions as well. But that is never really resolved until the 1690s, the so-called financial revolution under William III and William and Mary.
I mean, something that also fascinated me about Deverland was this sort of fraught diplomatic relationship between James and the English state before 1603. Because again, the way it's taught, James appears in 1603, but there's this sort of very skillful, sort of born out of weakness, trying to keep on the good side of a powerful neighbor, but also trying to serve his own interests as a legitimate state in his own right.
Yes, I think James is very skilled and pragmatic about his attitude to the English succession. As you say, it is often taken as a given that James succeeds to Elizabeth's throne, but that is so uncertain for the decade beforehand. Elizabeth does live a long time, certainly compared to her Tudor predecessors, but her death is kind of imminently expected any time, really, she is quite ill in her early reign, but certainly from the time of the sort of Armada onwards. And there are a lot of people who feel that the minute Elizabeth dies, England will be plunged into a horrendous war of succession with continental powers being involved. It's not helped by Elizabeth's own determined refusal to allow the succession to be discussed in any way, to actually make it a capital crime. So throughout James can never imagine a world in which he's not king, but he also can never imagine a world in which he is not being, alternatively flattered, harried, bossed, threatened. There is a very antagonistic relationship quite often with the English court. I mean, she is his godmother. She is also the person who puts his mother to death. And James has to navigate that relationship the whole way through his reign. There will always be factions in the court, mostly among the sort of more committed Protestants, who look to England as the natural alliance and who want to sort of align themselves with Elizabeth's court. There will always be also sort of francophone interests who look to a medieval Scottish old alliance, who remember that Mary, Queen of Scots' mother, had been French, that James is related to the French royal family. But then there is still that confessional problem that will involve some sort of Catholic alignment. I mean, James is quite good actually at playing those two elements off against each other. He doesn't have huge resources at all as King of Scotland. Part of his strategy for making himself the only credible successor to Elizabeth is to stay on good terms with Catholic powers, to make sure that they don't begin to rally behind a Catholic claimant, because to a lot of Catholics across Europe, whether they're in Scotland or in England or on the continent, the death of Elizabeth, for Catholics, this heretic usurper, is a real chance for England to rejoin the Catholic fold. I mean, the Counter-Reformation is making big advances on the continent. You know, regime change might be that opportunity to finally bring England away from its sort of Protestant experiments. And James is very careful to maintain good relations with the papacy, with Spain, with France, with other countries. He has a reputation for tolerance in Scotland. He doesn't go after Catholics for their beliefs. It becomes widely suspected from the early 1590s onwards that his wife, Anna of Denmark, who was born a Lutheran and married James as a Lutheran, it is suspected, with good reason, that she covertly converts to Catholicism. He is also the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who most Catholics regard after her death as a sort of unofficial martyr. So James plays on all of this to sort of tell Catholic powers, you won't have anything to fear from me acceding to the throne. At the same time, he also publishes quite a lot of quite militantly anti-Catholic works in those times, and remains a very sort of committed Calvinist. But partly because of this, trying to keep all these plates spinning, which he does very successfully, he's probably therefore equally not trusted really by any party. He's often described as being a monarch who dissimulates all the time.
What kind of fascinates me about 1603 with that history and with that fraught relationship, with the fact that that not simply Elizabeth murdering his mother, but a whole sort of regime consensus and push, and all sort of, various officials, people like Sir Robert Cecil, all being in a government that viewed them warily, and then he becomes the king. So I was sort of curious, what was it like for both sides for that merger?
Often in these sorts of instances, you think, well, timing is kind of everything. And James is probably lucky, perhaps, that Essex launches his disastrous rising, because that was probably the faction within the English court that seemed most in favour of James's right to succeed, and that was not the Cecil faction. Then Essex is removed, and it's both sides. I think there is a recognition in the end that it would be better the devil you know and the devil you begin to know. Elizabeth doesn't know what's going on, but there is now evidence of a clandestine correspondence that starts between Cecil and James after Essex's downfall, that's really only known to about half a dozen people, is conducted under the most strict secrecy. I mean, this would be treason to Elizabeth's eyes. But it's an attempt to open up a channel of communication. James also sends ambassadors to England and sends them on a huge sort of, he often sends ambassadors, but they are on a particular sort of charm offensive. It's very important for him that he knows the personnel involved. There are also obviously sort of shuttle diplomacy to Edinburgh as well. So these channels of communication open, and much of it is very pragmatic advice. Do not rush this. There are times when James wonders, is Elizabeth intending to sort of live forever? He I think that also reassures him. There isn't a sort of information void in the latter years, in that he has a channel of communication open to those closest to Elizabeth. And even things like a proclamation announcing her death, the draft of that is sent to him, before she dies. So, had this been exposed, things could have again blown up, but they didn't. That is an interesting point when one then comes on to talk about what James comes south with a very clear idea about creating a new country, Great Britain. And it's a very interesting project, and James invests a lot of creative energy into it, and it's certainly, in terms of the pamphlets and writings of James's early reign, it is the dominant political subject. But again, it's timing. For James, that is 1603 gives him the opportunity. I mean, God has worked matters in a way that he is now, as Stuart king, now monarch of this empire, as he describes it, of Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales, with a sort of toehold in the continent, in some Dutch cautionary towns. And now this is the opportunity to make something bigger. For the English, the crisis has passed. James can come to the throne. They are really not that interested. And then they get quite alarmed by the idea that he's hoping to sort of abolish England and create Britain. And really, there are just two different worldviews for them. For them, the crisis was Elizabeth's death and making sure that London didn't become the sort of scene of some bloody continental war of succession with lots of different claimants all asserting their rights. It all goes very smoothly. James comes south, and they really aren't that interested in any other geopolitical reconfiguration.
I mean, it did amuse me, a point in the book about sort of various English MPs submitting a bill on sort of respecting Magna Carta. And it sort of made me think of when there were various people during the pandemic going on about Magna Carta. It sort of seemed like a historical thread sort of running through.
Yeah, and its big moment is the 17th century. Cook sort of almost single-handedly sort of rehabilitates Magna Carta to make it into this touchstone about trial by jury, about impeachment, all sorts of things. It's very skillful, because certainly post James's reign, Magna Carta has a prominence that it probably didn't before. But there is nervousness, real nervousness, because James, just to what we were talking about earlier, James is an experienced king. He is very interested in politics and in the law. He is not one like Elizabeth to delegate those sorts of matters to her judges and to her principal secretary. He takes English judges aback by saying, I can sit in any of these courts. They're all my courts after all. So, his talk about issuing new charters by proclamation, he simply announces that he is King of Great Britain. Judges put together an opinion saying, well, we're not actually sure this is even legal. I mean, James, in the end, he's very clear that they're wrong. I think in the end, he is probably right. There was a famous case in the 1950s in Scotland about whether or not Elizabeth II should really be Elizabeth I in Scotland. And the decision in the end by the Court of Session was that monarchs can choose to call themselves whatever they want to call themselves. And if she is Elizabeth II, she is Elizabeth II. If James wishes to call himself King of Great Britain, he is King of Great Britain. But it's just interesting the ways in which a lot of James's assertions of things that he feels are self-evident and totally within his power to say often provoke very nervous reactions among either the Church of England or common lawyers or parliamentarians.
I guess another problem with the popular memory of the Stuart period is that it seems to be essentially James succeeds Elizabeth. This is almost immediately followed by the Gunpowder Plot. And then there's a hazy blur until Charles I. Yeah, it's, James reigned for a good 2 decades, like after 1603. So I wondered if you could give an overview of that half of the reign.
Yeah. I mean, the Gunpowder Plot is, and it's almost a sort of culmination of all that James has always been worried about Catholic theories of deposition and extremism. He'd had a pretty bumpy time as king in Scotland. He had been abducted and held under house arrest for 10 months in the Rutherford raid. There'd been other conspiracies. He claimed attempted assassinations. The Gowrie conspiracy in 1600 is a murky episode. But James yoked the Gowrie conspiracy, which was an alleged attempt to hold him prisoner and assassinate him in one of his in a noble's hunting lodge, with the Gunpowder Plot. Says they both happened on Tuesday. They were both designed to kill me. So it is a massive shock to the political establishment. It wouldn't just have been James that was killed, it was his two sons, it was the whole political establishment. Thereafter, James rules. It probably his attention turns away from British Union post Gunpowder Plot to a lot of these continental theological controversies. I mean, the Gunpowder Plot provides proof for him of what Catholic extremist views can lead to. Initially, the response is fairly stony from continental Catholicism, despite James writing initially anonymously and then under his own name, warning Catholic monarchs on the continent of the need to reject papal theories of excommunication and deposition. Then Henri IV, Henry IV of France, to whom James is related, is murdered by a Catholic fanatic in 1610, and James says, "This is what I've been telling you. This is the threat that Catholic extremism poses to all monarchs, whether they're Protestant or Catholic." But there are lots of other things going on at the time. I mean, one of the difficulties of writing this book was just the sheer number of areas in which James is really actively engaged. I mean, one of his most sort of momentous legacies is the King James Bible, which arose out of the Hampton Court Conference in 1604. This was something to which James wanted to attach royal sponsorship, and it takes 7 years to produce, with different companies working in Oxford and in London and Cambridge. We often think of Charles I, skipping ahead a moment, those 11 years of his personal reign, personal rule it's called, where he doesn't call Parliament between 1629 and 1640, and how catastrophic this is. James also doesn't call Parliament for 7 years in England between 1614 and 1621. I mean, he has a very adversarial, rambunctious, unhappy relationship with the English Houses of Parliament, largely over his frustration that they will not vote him adequate financial supply, and their determination to hold on to those purse strings as long as he continues to make the kind of inflated claims about royal prerogative that he does. So he has a 7-year personal rule between 1614 and 1621, but what really obliges him to call Parliament again in 1621 in England is the eruption of the 30 Years' War. Obviously, that's a later term, but what becomes the 30 Years' War on continental Europe that starts in 1618. And he is centrally involved in it because it arises as a result of the decision by his son-in-law, married his daughter, Princess Elizabeth, his son-in-law, the Palatine Elector, Frederick V, to accept the crown of Bohemia at an invitation by the Bohemian estates, who do not want the Catholic successor to take over. Unwisely, Elizabeth and Frederick go to Prague and are installed as monarchs, and then ejected, and the Battle of White Mountain is the end of Frederick and Elizabeth in Bohemia. But that then becomes this continent-wide sort of conflagration of big set-piece encounters between sort of Habsburg Catholic forces and other Protestant forces. The kind of Protestant leader that emerges from this is much more Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. But huge pressure is put on James not only to do his fatherly duty and give support to his daughter and son-in-law, but to lead some great Protestant crusade against Catholic powers. And James is both sceptical that this will work, but also knows that he can't do that without large amounts of money being voted.
I mean, I'm really interested in the interaction between foreign policy and domestic politics. So something that really interests me about James was his sort of emphasis on peace and diplomacy, and being quite successful in negotiating treaties and sort of agreements, and then also just how unpopular they were.
They being?
So the Treaty of London, or sort of trying to avoid getting drawn into the war with Spain before his death.
Yeah. One of the first things he does is negotiate the 1604 Treaty of London. I mean, he comes to England in 1603. England has been fighting this long-running war with Spain. They've been offering financial and political support to the United Provinces, the Dutch Republic, who have sort of thrown off Spanish rule. James is very clear from the outset, Spain isn't my enemy. I've no quarrel with the King of Spain. This is a war that is not going anywhere. It's costing a huge amount of money. It has really destabilizing implications for Ireland, which is when there'd been nearly a decade-long war in the 1590s in Ireland, with Spain always looking at Ireland as a strategic way into the English mainland or British mainland. So James negotiates very quickly the Treaty of London, sort of amity between Spain and England. Gets a lot of diplomatic kudos by the fact that it happens in London, and there's a lot of Spanish members of the Council of State saying, "Why are we going there? Why we look like the petitioners?" And it's one of the first peace treaties between Protestant and Catholic powers in the sort of post-Reformation era. Fantastic painting of the Treaty of London with sort of the Spanish ambassadors and the English sort of negotiators on both sides of the table, and among them was the person who had led the English force against the Armada. I mean, this was a major diplomatic achievement, but it was very, very unpopular. And especially when then James also engaged in a lot of dynastic diplomacy, trying to marry off his children, initially Prince Henry, his heir that he had written Basilican Doran for, in whom great sort of hopes are vested, trying to negotiate both a lucrative dowry for him to try and solve his financial problems, but also one that would give a lot of diplomatic leverage. He marries his daughter, Princess Elizabeth, as I said, to the Elector Palatine, so that is a very securely sort of Protestant alliance. And James hopes that, and then he's got a younger son, Charles, who becomes Charles I, that through these marriage alliances, he can begin to achieve peace or at least stop conflicts from escalating. He has limited success on that front, but I think James is both aware of his financial position, but I think he's always aware too that he's also ruling quite a complex multiple monarchy. Maybe not huge, Britain, but it's big. But there are very different religious confessional dynamics there as well. I mean, England is a young Protestant country, but one that securely Protestant with a hierarchy of bishops. Scotland, a securely Protestant country, but one that resists sort of hierarchies of bishops and is much more inclined towards Presbyterian models. And Ireland, which has a nominal minority Episcopalian church, the Church of Ireland, but in which the vast majority of the population remain Catholic. And, in each of these countries, there's a minority that prefers the majority religion in one of the others. In each of these countries, other foreign continental powers will be looking to establish influence or interference, and James is very aware that this is a challenge that, say, the Habsburgs don't have. I mean, all of their territories are Catholic, so I think James is very aware that this confessionally mixed multiple monarchy is even harder to govern, and I think this is a subtlety that is lost on Charles I.
So, being gay, something else that interests me about James is his sexuality. And as I said, ahead of this interview, I've been watching Mary and George about his allegedly about his relationship with his favourite, George Villiers. And I think a sort of frustration queer people have with history is, on the one hand, the sexuality of a king or a queen or a president might be questions about it might be overblown into sort of saying they were gay. And then on the other hand, straight historians might sort of confidently declare that two historical figures were just good friends, even though any experience of the closet can sort of see signs. So I'm curious about what you found about James and his sexuality.
Mm-hmm. It's something that has sort of obsessed historians, and I think it has disproportionately coloured interpretations of James in different eras, because, as you say, there are often writ onto one individual is a sort of whole generations of different types of perspective. So I mean, I'm interested. I'm interested in both sides of James, if you like. I mean, James clearly is infatuated, deeply in love, real relationships of every type, physical, emotional, whatever, with a series of male favourites. I mean, this begins with his older French cousin who arrives when he's a young teenager in Scotland, Esme Stuart, and without conclusive evidence, which there really isn't, one can speculate about how physical that relationship was. But what is absolutely clear is that James absolutely adored him. And clearly at the end of his life too, James absolutely adored Buckingham, and there's much more, much more evidence, if you like, of their relationship. But that is a constant throughout James's life. At the same time, James is also absolutely committed to his dynastic duty to produce heirs. And although he's very clear, he writes an open letter to his Scottish subjects, in 1590 explaining why he's decided to marry Anna of Denmark. And he says, God willing, I could have abstained a lot longer, but I must get on with this. He will make his claim to the English throne much stronger if he is seen to have heirs following him, given the dynastic crises that Tudor England has experienced. So he marries Anna of Denmark. They have they have three surviving children, Henry and Elizabeth and Charles, but they also have others, both in Scotland and in England, most of whom sadly die in infancy. But until well through the 1600s, they are producing children, and that is a functioning relationship. And I suppose what I've tried to do is say neither side should erase the other. I think we tend to think now in much more clear-cut, binary, doctrinaire ways about sexuality than contemporaries did at the time. And yes, contemporaries were alarmed by James's closeness to Esme Stuart or to Buckingham, but not usually because of, this was another man with whom he's in love. In Esme Stuart's case, it was because they feared that he was put in to promote French interests in Scotland. And in Buckingham's case, it was because, he controlled all the patronage and, was often seen as being more bellicose, particularly towards the end of his reign, than James had been. So it was often more as in terms of the policies and the sort of monopoly of access that those individuals would then sort of exert over James. That was what really worried contemporaries. There's a lot of work on sort of Shakespeare's, polyvalent, whatever you want to call it, but Shakespeare's sexuality, and Shakespeare's queerness. I think, is it Will Tosh has recently said, he wasn't sort of gold star gay, but, he was clearly bisexual. But that shouldn't erase his family relationships and his relationships with his wife. So, that's very much the line I've taken. Other historians have sort of said things like, how can James be so hypocritical as to say that, sodomy is one of these crimes that should never be forgiven, given everything that's going on? And again, I think one has to sort of take a step back and think, well, sodomy was a very rarely prosecuted crime in early modern England. That doesn't mean that those sorts of relationships weren't happening, but sodomy would have to be seen. There would have to be some criminal element to it. There would have to be somebody who wished to prosecute, on the grounds of, sort of presumably coercion or some sort of other advantage being extracted. One other thing I say in the book as well is, homophobia has certainly coloured subsequent generations' approach to James, whether that's in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. But so too has, at the time, Scotophobia was a far more prevalent, virulent prejudice. I mean, the numbers of people who are deeply suspect of James simply because he is Scottish, are very high, in the sort of casual anti-Scottish slurs, and the number of times James has to issue proclamations trying to say, I won't stand for this. You've got to stop doing this sort of thing.
Something that's been interesting about watching Mary and George is sort of although it is a sort of out and proud James, it's also one that isn't particularly scholarly, isn't particularly politically interested. So it's sort of doing a disservice in other ways, it seems, watching it.
I think that's right. I think that misses all of that. It has to be also said that those are James's final years, and one of the other things I look at in the biography is James did suffer declining health from about the late sort of 1618, 1619. His Queen Anna dies in 1619. James is very seriously ill around that time. There is evidence that he was becoming physically much more frail and much more emotionally dependent on Buckingham to the exclusion of all others than maybe. He had a massive infatuation with Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, in the mid-16 teens, but then there were other significant players sort of close to James.
Did anything surprise you about James between Devilland and writing the biography?
So I didn't really mean to write the biography when I finished Devilland. It wasn't sort of the next thing I must do, but I knew that there was an awful lot left on the cutting room floor that I hadn't been able to include. I do think, I've been working kind of pretty flat out on him now to the exclusion of all other things, for several years now, and I find him endlessly fascinating. So I don't think that's surprising, but you might be expected to be sort of, you've had enough of someone when you've been working that closely on him. And if anything, I just appreciate how little we still know, how much more there still is to do, which is exciting, given that this happened sort of 400 years ago.
I mean, that sort of touches on what I was going to ask, do you like him?
I find a lot to admire in him. I mean, I'm also under no illusions. I mean, one thing I'm also quite clear in the book is he is pretty misogynistic. He does not have much time for women. He particularly doesn't like women who he feels are unduly clever or trying to be clever. So there's a sort of gut-wrenching moment where this teenage prodigy, Bathsheba Malkin, is presented to him in the mid-1600s, and she's written this sort of octolingual in all these languages, sort of encomium about him. And it is alleged that he just sort of snorted and said, can she spin? Sort of instantly sort of deflating. So I entertain no illusions that James would be, interested in my views. So therefore, do I like him? I mean, would I like to I would love to have been a fly on the wall in some of these discussions. I don't find all aspects of his character attractive, but I do like the irony. I mean, he's very often ironic. I like the wit. I like the sort of just the voracious way in which he tags onto new ideas. I mean, there's a demonstration of what is the world's first submarine journey in front of him in the Thames by Cornelius Drebbel, and immediately he wants an order for 99 of them. I mean, he is. You can't fault his energy and his enthusiasms, and I don't share his passion for hunting, so I would have found all of that, I think, pretty tedious. But I certainly find him a really interesting individual.
Is there anything you're working on now, or are you going to take a break?
I've got ideas, but I always find it quite hard I'm still sort of finishing the proofs and things. I'm still doing that. This is a year of anniversaries. The college in which I'm involved is 675 years old, and I've just been writing a piece for a book that we're writing about that, and that's actually been quite good to remind me that 400 years since James's death is actually not that long compared to Trinity Hall's 675. So no, I'm writing very small pieces. I do have another big project, but I always find it quite hard to have time until this one is finished and out.
Clare Jackson, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to thank Clare again for sparing the time. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like, rate and comment. If you want to pre-order Clare's upcoming biography of James, The Mirror of Great Britain, visit the link to the Penguin site. The link is in the show notes. You'll also find the Strategy Hour bookshop page if you want to buy Devilland, England Under Siege. Strategy Hour will be going on a short spring break, but be assured, when we return, I have some great guests lined up for you. Hope you all tune in there.